Mindlessly using oil as a weapon. It says the Iraqis have opened a pipeline and are dumping oil into the Persian Gulf at the rate of more than 4 million gallons a day. On the potential effect, here's ABC's Ned Potter.
The oil was so thick it gurgled as it washed onto the Gulf shoreline. It coated seabirds, sent fumes high into the air, and provoked angry words from the president about Saddam Hussein.
Now he resorts to enormous environmental damage but in terms of turning loose a lot of oil. No military advantage to him whatsoever in this. It's not going to help him at all, absolutely not.
The Pentagon said the crude oil was apparently being released from an export terminal off the Kuwaiti coast. It had mostly spread toward the Saudi shoreline from there, carried by local currents.
This is clearly an act of environmental terrorism, and it's likely to be more than a dozen times bigger than the Alaska oil spill at Valdez.
Military sources say oil on the shoreline would not greatly hamper a ground assault because oil spills are hard to set on fire and most troops would likely land by helicopter or hovercraft. But heavy equipment like tanks might be hampered. The Pentagon said it's already at work on ways around the problem. Environmentalists and pollution experts had other concerns in mind. The Sierra Club, for instance, said the dumping could destroy the Gulf for decades, limiting fishing and the food supply. And if it spread far enough down the Gulf, the oil could clog desalination plants that supply most of the region's drinking water.
This is a situation where the spillage is intentional, deliberate, and as a result, it could continue for as long as the hostilities continue. As a result, it has the potential for becoming one of the most severe environmental disasters in history.
Late today, an oil spill cleanup firm in Texas confirmed it has received a call from the Saudi government for help in clearing its beaches. Ned Potter, ABC News, Washington.
Still in the Middle East, 4 more attacks today apparently related to the war. In the Greek capital Athens, bombs went off at 3 banks, 2 U.S. and 1 British, and at the home of the French military attaché. There was some damage. No one was hurt. The State Department has added India to the list of countries where it thinks anti-American violence may occur as a result of the war. And it says Americans planning to visit India should postpone their trips, and those who are there should consider leaving until, in the department's words, the Gulf crisis abates. In a moment, the air war, still looking for the Republican Guards. Iraqi civilians learning to cope with the daily bombardment. And the electronic search for Saddam Hussein.
This is the sound
No U.S. casualties today as the pounding of Iraqi ground forces continued without air resistance. Here's ABC's Bill Rediker.
Squadrons of F-16s taking off today, heading for Republican Guard positions in Kuwait and southern Iraq.
Looks good. Target area is supposed to be good, and we got good results this morning, and we expect the same this afternoon. And as long as the weather's staying good for us, it helps us out quite a bit.
Armed with 500-pound high-explosive bombs and armor-piercing cluster bombs designed to rip apart tanks, the pilots and their crews have been working for the past 24 hours, concentrating on Iraq's best troops.
These are good for people, tanks, stuff like that.
Pilots say they have been surprised at how many troops they've seen on the ground, how many they will have to hit.
We're still focusing very largely on the, and not exclusively, but on the Republican Guard and certainly all the Scud sites.
At sea, F-14 Tomcats assisted in the campaign today and continued to try to cut off supply lines to Iraqi troops.
We've also gone in, as you know, into the naval port facilities, up into the areas where we've cut rail lines, also down into a couple of the major logistics areas, as well as laying out mining.
Aboard the Aegis cruiser Valley Forge, the most sophisticated surveillance system in the Navy has been tracking the Allied campaign against the Republican Guards. But the ship is also on alert should the Iraqi Air Force attempt to fly and launch an aerial attack against ships or air bases in the region.
I think that we can expect something dramatic, some last-ditch kind of endeavor that he might use. Like I say, this is a snake in a woodpile kind of situation. We think he can strike at any time.
At the Military Central Command briefing today, General Johnston said the Allied forces are holding about 60 prisoners of war, about half of them deserters who had turned themselves in.
A large number, if not all of the Iraqi EPWs are covered with lice, and they have some open sores, and some, if not all, report having pretty slim rations, a few saying that they're down to 1 meal a day.
General Johnston said they seemed grateful to be captured. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
So there was a lot on the president's mind today, and he decided about noon to talk about it. He came to the White House briefing room, and here's our White House correspondent, Britt Hume.
The president worked today to manage the political side of this war. This morning he assured a group of Arab Americans that Operation Desert Storm is designed to get Iraq out of Kuwait, but in doing so to leave Iraq standing. Those who heard him seemed convinced.
We know, and the president emphasized, that his objective is not to destroy or dismantle Iraq.
Mr. Bush returned to that theme in an afternoon news conference.
We don't want to see a destabilized Iraq when this is all over. The problems are not with the people in the streets of Baghdad.
The president also tried to capitalize on what the administration considers Saddam's extraordinary clumsiness in influencing public opinion, particularly in the U.S.
Saddam Hussein continues to amaze the world. First, he uses these Scud missiles that have no military value whatsoever. Then he uses the lives of prisoners of war, parading them and threatening to use them as shields. Obviously, they have been brutalized.
Mr. Bush saved some of his strongest words for the oil spill in the Gulf, remembering, no doubt, that U.S. environmentalists had warned that war could bring just such an occurrence.
This thing today troubles me very much because there's no rationality to it. It looks desperate. It looks last gasp. It doesn't measure up to any military doctrine of any kind, but it's kind of sick.
The president's case for intervening in the Gulf has rested heavily on the idea that Saddam Hussein is a monster who must be stopped. The White House believes tonight that Saddam's conduct this past week has gone a long way to prove that case. Britt Hume, ABC News, the White House.
We'll have more news about the war in just a moment. Of his Revolutionary Command Council. Iraq radio says the Iraqis shot down 10 Allied planes and missiles. The Iraqis say its troops were not forced off a Kuwaiti island that Allied forces claimed to have captured yesterday. They left voluntarily, according to the Iraqis, and Iraqi civilians are being hit by Allied air attacks. Here's ABC's Sheila McVicker.
Iraq continued to try to make its point about civilian casualties and damage today, approving the release of these pictures. Western television crews still in Baghdad were taken to this residential neighborhood where the Iraqis say 2 houses were completely destroyed, 6 others seriously damaged, 3 people hurt. These Iraqis no longer believe Allied claims of targeting only military sites. We were really surprised, she says. This is just a place where people live. After more than a week of repeated attacks, people in Baghdad seem to be adjusting. When the sirens sound, most people no longer scramble for cover. Some shops have reopened, but food is scarce and there is no electricity. Journalist Lami Sandoni left Baghdad yesterday. She says Iraqis are leading a simpler life.
They're going back to the way they used to live in the rural areas before the modern facilities, and this is not very difficult for Iraqis since it hasn't been very long ago.
And Iraqis told her, in spite of the sacrifices the war has forced on them, they will stand with Saddam Hussein.
Because for them this is a battle of life and death. This is their sovereignty is at stake, and they might be critical of him, some of them might not like him, but they're behind him.
To bolster morale, Iraqi television broadcasts pictures like this. But the Iraqi government also knows it is responsible for the safety of downed Allied airmen. So to discourage beatings and worse, the government reward for pilots turned in unharmed has been raised to $90,000. While Iraqis try to cope with the war, thousands of foreigners try to flee. The border with Jordan is still closed. Some people have been trapped on the Iraqi side without food or gasoline for nearly 3 days. A Western diplomat said if the refugees are unable to get out, there may be what he called a large-scale human tragedy. Sheila McVicker, ABC News, Amman.
There is a report on the front page of today's Washington Post that Allied forces may have pinpointed Saddam Hussein's location one night last week, but were prevented from attacking because of bad weather. The military in Saudi Arabia today said it wasn't true. President Bush said today the U.S. is not in the business of targeting the Iraqi leader personally. Other military sources have told us if the U.S. does get Hussein, it'll be by accident, which does not mean he is completely safe. Here's ABC's John Martin.
U.S. military officials insist Saddam Hussein himself is not a target. Assassination is against United States law, but his whereabouts are a vital piece of military intelligence. The CIA has a task force watching Iraq. It has not been ordered to locate Saddam Hussein as an individual, but informed officials say that if he is discovered, the word will go directly to Pentagon officials who are not prohibited from attacking the Iraqi command structure.
You cannot distinguish between the leadership and the command system. They are inseparable components.
To find the Iraqi high command, airborne tracking units have been recording telephone and radio traffic from the sky. Satellites listen for electronic emissions from command bunkers, hoping to hear codes or a telltale burst of messages.
All these would suggest the presence of a key member of the leadership, such as Saddam Hussein.
High-frequency direction finders in nearby countries, Oman, Cyprus, and Turkey, pinpoint the source of the signals. The clues are fed by satellite to the National Security Agency outside Washington and to the British Government Communications Headquarters in Cheltenham, England. To avoid detection, diplomatic sources say, Hussein has not used telephones in 6 weeks, preferring face-to-face meetings with battlefield commanders. This one reportedly took place yesterday. And even if the U.S. pinpoints his location, there is another challenge.
To say that he's there at this moment is one thing, and then go half an hour later and be certain that he will be there.
If he is there, however, and if there is time, military experts recognize that hitting that target could be the fastest way to end the war. John Martin, ABC News, Washington.
We'll be back in just a minute. Analyst Tony Cordesman, who, among other things, wrote a very well-regarded book about Iraq's war with Iran. Tony'd like to talk about two weapons tonight, oil and the Scud missile. Using them from Saddam Hussein's point of view, does it make good sense?
Peter, it does make a kind of grim sense from his perspective. War always has a political as well as a military dimension, and this is a war of attrition. His Scud attacks are his only real chance to divide the coalition, to get himself a world impact, to divide the entire Arab world. And his attacks on the oil centers may seem like a minor harassment at this point, but if we look at the map, what we see over here is that they will eventually land on the beaches. Any of the Marines that have to land through here have to climb through the oil. It will interfere with their landing craft and also with their heavy equipment. Finally, if it moves down the coast, it could affect the plants that produce drinking water out of seawater. This, even if it doesn't have a military effect, at the same time may persuade other nations outside the coalition to push for a ceasefire to help him with a settlement. And finally, if all of this fails, he has shown he can still strike out, and if he is martyred, he at least will have had that symbol of strength.
Can we look to the Iran-Iraq war for any education about this?
The only cases we can see there are that he was, again, ruthless in exploiting every opportunity to go on to new weapons, to new techniques, even when they did not achieve a major military effect, but did achieve a political effect.
And having studied him for this long, Tony, do you ever doubt him when he says something?
I think there have been times he's bluffed, but very, very rarely. And it's interesting that every time he threatened to escalate with chemical weapons or two chemical weapons, he did it.
Tony Cordesman in our Washington Bureau, thank you. A program note. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a program about the war for children.